Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us tonight. My name is Morgan Lentis, and I work at WLKY News. And thank you for joining us this evening. On behalf of Norton Healthcare, the Norton Healthcare Foundation, and care tenders, I would like to welcome you to Go Confidently. If this is your first time joining us, we do hope to see you again at future Go Confidently events. This is an ongoing speaker series held multiple times a year. Now, it's meant to inspire and motivate people to be the very best versions of themselves. Norton Healthcare brings speakers from all across the country, carrying with them different messages. So please keep an eye out for upcoming speakers. You can do that at nortonhealthcare.com/goconfidently, and be sure to register if you see one coming up that interests you. Speakers for 2020 are already being scheduled. Go Confidently is an event Norton Healthcare takes pride in. This event is an example of how the healthcare organization aims to take care of the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. Norton Healthcare recognizes that it's not enough to respond to people's needs only within the walls of its hospitals. By bringing thoughtful speakers to our community, Norton Healthcare hopes to arm people with tools needed to live lives they imagined, not only through good physical health, but through mindfulness, living with intent, and finding peace. And when we think about peace, tonight's speaker is a perfect fit for inspiring us to find peace within ourselves and to make peace with others. Feldman Bettencourt is an author, marketer, a speaker. She is reported from many countries, and her award-winning journalism has appeared in publications including Psychology Today, Salon, the San Francisco Chronicle, Glamour, Harper's Bazaar, and Southwest the magazine. Her internationally acclaimed award-winning book, Triumph of the Heart, Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World, explores forgiveness through science, stories, and memoir. She holds a master's degree from the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York, and she lives in Denver with her husband and her children. We have a very exciting program ahead of us tonight, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Feldman Bettencourt.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about forgiveness. And I'm going to start by saying that I never, ever thought that I would be speaking to you, much less writing a book about forgiveness. Okay, so the first reason for that is that I spent many years as a journalist writing about some pretty gritty, hardcore topics. So I covered immigration, I wrote about poverty, I wrote about terminal illness, all kinds of things that were kind of getting at the most difficult aspects of life. And forgiveness, if I thought about it at all, seemed pretty woo-woo, seemed pretty out there, maybe kind of wimpy, And the other reason why I never thought I would write a book about forgiveness is because I really enjoyed holding grudges. It felt really good, to feel so right about how wrong some people were. Does anyone relate to that? Yeah, it's kind of like eating a Snickers bar and it's so delicious, and even though maybe afterward you don't feel so good, but at the time it's just perfect. So, however, I also was always really interested in how people really get over the most difficult things, how people can keep going when some of the hardest things in life happen to them. And that's what drove my reporting, when I was a journalist writing about war and genocide and these different things. And it's part of what got me to this topic. So a number of years ago, I landed a story, it was a cover story for a national magazine, about a man named Azim Khamisa. Now, Azim was originally from Kenya, and he moved to San Diego and became a very, very successful investment banker. So one morning he was standing in his kitchen and he was drinking tea. He was a little bit tired. He'd been on a business trip to Mexico and had arrived the night before. And he was still trying to wake up, drinking his tea. He got a call and he picked up the phone. And on the other line there was this investigator. this police investigator. And the investigator said, "Sir, I'm so sorry to tell you this, but your son has been murdered." Now, Azim knew that this couldn't be possible because his son Tariq was a very responsible college student, and he was doing at least one side job on the side of going to school. He was a pizza delivery guy, and he hung out with some really, responsible kids. So clearly this was a mistake, and so, Azim told the investigator, "I'm going to clear this up, thank you so much, but there must be some confusion." So he hung up, and he dialed his son Tariq's fiance, Jennifer. And Jennifer answered the phone, and she was crying so hard that she couldn't speak. So in that moment, he knew that this was real. This had happened. Every parent's nightmare, right? His son had been shot and killed. So he passed out in that moment. He dropped the phone. He passed out cold. He hit his head on the stove behind him. And when he came to, he says there was this one phrase that rang in his mind. The phrase was, "There were victims on both ends of the gun." He didn't know where this came from. It was just in his mind. There were victims on both ends of the gun. Now, Azim would later attribute that statement to God, and that is his absolute belief. He went on to forgive the teenager who murdered his son, and I should say that at that moment, when he found out about the killing, he didn't know who was responsible. He didn't know what had happened. Well, he ended up forgiving the teenager who had perpetrated the shooting, and this teenager, Tony Hicks, happened to be the first juvenile in the state of California who was prosecuted as an adult. So he forgave this teen, but not only that, he reached out to the teenager's family, to Tony's family. And he ended up becoming very, very close friends with Tony's grandfather, a man named Ples Felix. And not only did they become friends, but they started this extraordinary organization that's called the Tariq Khamisa Foundation, named after Azim's son. And what they do is they go to middle school assemblies in at-risk schools around the country, and they take the stage, and Azim shares how he lost his only son to this murder, and Ples shares how he lost his only grandson to the same event. And as you can imagine, it's very impactful for the children who attend the assemblies. And to this day, they have reached at least 9 million young people around the world, because they travel internationally as well. So I was lucky enough to spend 2 weeks with Azim and Ples, reporting this story about them. And it was extremely moving. And one of the reasons it was that I happened to be going through kind of a bitter period in my own life. I was struggling to earn enough money as a journalist. The industry was going through huge changes. The recession had happened. The internet was, happening. And making money as a journalist was just tough. It was tougher than I'd ever thought. And not only that, I'd been through a breakup that was really, really difficult. And I was just kind of having a pity party, for myself. And so here I am. I'm feeling sorry for myself. And I am spending time with a man who has experienced the worst thing that anyone who is a parent could ever imagine experiencing. And he was just this beacon of light and purpose. So I wanted to know more about that. And he talked about how forgiveness specifically was really the key for him to be able to get through that tough period and not get over it, because you don't ever get over something like that. But he says forgiveness was the way that he was able to create a life of real meaning and purpose after that happened. So I wanted to know first, okay, so that sounds inspiring, but is there really science that shows that forgiveness is an impactful thing for our actual health and our well-being? So I looked into that, and I found that yes, it absolutely is. And the first body of research that I found that's very well established, that has been around for a long time, is all of the research around the impact of anger and resentment. So we know that when we're holding a grudge, when we're angry, when we're resentful over a long period of time, every time we think about that person,
or that event, we're flooding our brains with stress chemicals, right? With adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol. And over time, what that does is, first of all, it increases blood pressure, right? It's bad for our heart health. And it also really impacts our brain. So what happens is that little by little, those stress chemicals impede the brain's frontal lobe's ability to solve problems. And the other thing it does is it makes us more likely to be depressed and anxious. So that's the first body of evidence. And then the second, I wasn't aware of. This was new to me. So there are about 20 years, 25 years worth of studies about forgiveness specifically and how forgiveness impacts health. So really the strongest area of research about forgiveness has to do with, one, heart health. So forgiveness therapies or forgiveness practices reduce stress, and they can actually reverse symptoms of anxiety and depression. They can also increase blood flow to the heart and lower blood pressure. So in one study, there was a group of cardiac patients who had gone through not only the nutritional counseling and the exercise counseling that's standard, they also got these forgiveness practices, or kind of a therapy that contained forgiveness components. And they showed increased blood flow to their hearts compared to the control group, which only did the nutrition and the exercise counseling. So that's really important. And here's the thing though, I was not happy about this. Remember how we talked about my affinity for grudges and the Snickers bars? Yeah. So this was not happy news for me. The fact that really, if we truly want to be healthy in mind, body, spirit, if we want our hearts to be healthy and be in a good mood, like, we have to be able to do this. And I just thought, crap. So then I wanted to know, being the curious, objective journalist at heart, that I've always been, I just wanted to know, how does this transpire? How does this happen for different people in different situations, all around the world, from the interpersonal to the collective? And that quest turned into my book, Triumph of the Heart, Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World. So I got to spend about a year and a half traveling around. I traveled and reported in about 10 states for the book. I got to spend several weeks in Africa doing research and reporting for the book. And I looked at everything from, how do people forgive parents, for big things like abuse, and for smaller things. What is the role of forgiveness in intimate relationships? What is the role of apology and amends? How does that, interplay with forgiveness? And then moving more into the collective arena, I got to spend time at a Baltimore school that had really struggled with severe fighting and suspensions and just a lot of violence in a tough neighborhood. And they instituted something called circles, which I'll talk about later, but they're essentially research-proven and very simple forgiveness practices that foster, people's ability to get along. And they saw massively reduced suspensions and reduced fighting after that. In Rwanda, I got to spend time with genocide survivors and perpetrators who had lived to, who had learned to live in peace through forgiveness practices. And it was all, very inspiring, obviously. And then after that, so it wasn't until the book came out that, I was giving talks about it, I was doing book signings and doing media interviews. And I realized that all of these people who I had interviewed, particularly the people who had forgiven really, really big things, like Azim, they shared some core habits, some core practices, or, I would say habits. And so I call them the 3 key habits of good forgivers. And I should say there's one precursor to these 3 habits, and that precursor is that these people committed to forgive. So whatever, there were different reasons for it. Some came from religious persuasions, others did not, but all of them for one reason or another, committed that they were going to forgive. So the first habit is that these people are authentic. Now, what do I mean by authentic? I mean that they let themselves feel the way they feel, which sounds simple, right? But do we always do that? No, we don't always let ourselves feel the way we feel. We often judge ourselves and, self-flagellate or pretend we don't feel that way, right? Oh, you're all saying, none of you are raising your hands, but I know you're out there. I know you're out there. Yeah, the pretender. I'm a pretender. Yeah. But the people who are authentic, they really let themselves, in big situations of big losses or big transgressions, they let themselves grieve. They were good at grief, it turns out. So take Azim. So Azim, he lost his son. He was horribly depressed, obviously. He was suicidal at times. He let himself go to a friend's cabin by himself for about a week up in Northern California. And he just spent a week being really, really, really sad, looking at pictures of his son, writing, crying, doing whatever he needed to do. And then he got really angry. He was enraged. And he wasn't necessarily enraged at Tony, the teenager who shot his son, but he was enraged at the fact that he had left violence in Kenya to raise his family here, and lo and behold, his son gets killed in America, and it just enraged him that we tolerate this level of youth violence in our country. So he could have done something violent, right? He could have taken that anger out in a violent way. He could have killed himself, could have hurt someone else. Instead, he really channeled that anger in a very proactive and productive way, right? By every day he gets up in front of these middle schoolers and he tells a story and he works towards peace every day. So that's how he channeled his anger. Now, there's a woman who I had the privilege of spending time with in Rwanda. Her name's Chantal. And interestingly, she and I are exactly the same age. And so that means that in 1994, while I was a high school student at 16, going to parties and doing homework and doing sports and all of that, Chantal was a victim of the genocide with her entire family. And she was actually part of one of the largest massacres that happened in 1994 during the Rwandan genocide. She was the only person in her immediate family to survive. And she spent years dealing with that and years, of trauma work. And by the way, we think mental health care is not as accessible as it should be here, and I agree that it's not. However, in Rwanda, 20 years ago, it didn't even exist. So she had to do years of work to even just be able to get up in the morning. And she said to me, it took me 15 years to even think about forgiveness. But she was committed to it. And Chantal, just like other people who have gone through these horrific experiences, it's almost like they know on a visceral level, they don't know the research that we just talked about, right? But they know somehow that to survive, to keep going, and to have any quality of life, they have to forgive, period. That is the choice. It's forgive or die. And a lot of people talked about that. So that's the first quality that good forgivers share, is that they're authentic and they're good at grieving, and they let themselves do it. And that way they don't get stuck, right? So if you don't allow yourself to go through something, what you resist really does persist. That cheesy self-help line is actually true, as it turns out. So we've been talking about some really extreme examples, and I think they're very inspiring. I will say that it's really important to keep in mind that this all applies to those of us who are just kind of, going through the more mundane tasks of life, right? Our daily routine. So, you're driving to work and there's traffic because the construction that they've been doing still is going on. And so you get to work and you're late and you're kind of pissed off. And then, you find out that some colleague that you work with has gotten a promotion, and frankly, you think that colleague is pretty lazy. So you're not feeling great about that. that bothers you, gets up in your craw. And then you have a family event coming up, and your in-laws are hosting it, and you've been dutifully, texting your mother-in-law to find out what you're supposed to bring. Lo and behold, she texts you 3 hours before the event, and she wants some sort of, home-cooked dish. So that's just one day. But you see how going through those little things day by day, if we let ourselves get angry and irritated about those things over and over, day by day, day after day, for months and years, you can see how we're constantly flooding our brains with the stress chemicals, and we're making ourselves prone to heart issues and certainly mood issues. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the things that I love is mindfulness. And mindfulness, you've all, I'm sure, heard of it. It's originally from the Buddhist practice of mindfulness meditation. But it's just so simple, and it's a way to deal with this kind of daily onslaught of stuff that if we let it could really piss us off and have us be in a constant state of anger and resentment. So when you're being mindful, you simply notice your reaction. You notice that someone cuts you off in traffic and it really bothers you, and that person shouldn't have done that, and you let yourself feel the anger for a minute, and you observe it, and you realize that you're not your anger, you're not your reaction, you're actually, apart from that. You can notice it and be separate, and then you can let it go. So I think that's hugely useful. So number 2, the second key habit of these good forgivers, it's more of a mindset. It's this understanding that forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same. Have any of you noticed that we tend to collapse forgiveness with all kinds of other things like pardon, reconciliation, like this whole idea that, if you forgive someone, then you should be really excited to host them for Thanksgiving, all of that, right? Yeah, I thought that. I did. I thought that was the case. That's what forgiveness was. Well, come to find that the definition of forgiving is to release resentment. You can release resentment and have a relationship with someone, right? Or you can release resentment and you can never speak to that person again. So that gives us a lot of freedom. It's really important, I think. The Jewish philosopher Maimonides talked about levels of forgiveness, and I kind of see it as a spectrum where, on one end, there's, forgiving someone because you know that you're committed to your well-being, right? And then on the other end, there's forgiving someone and having them over for Thanksgiving. There's a lot of freedom in that. And in the book, in my chapter about people who forgave parents for big things and for littler things, there were 2 women who I happened to interview, and both had experienced incest at the hands of their fathers. Now, both of them forgave their fathers. One of them forgave her dad, and not only did she forgive him, she ended up nursing him on his deathbed when he was dying of cancer. He had actually gone to prison for abusing a number of other girls. He spent a number of years in prison, and then he was terminally ill, and they released him to die at home, and she took care of him. And it was really healing and cathartic for her to do that. It might be tough for some of us to understand that, but that's how it was for her. Now, there was another woman who I interviewed who had similar experiences growing up, and she too, forgave her dad. And she talks about how after she forgave him, she stopped talking to him because every time she spoke with him on the phone, he would usually be drunk, and he would usually, call her names or yell, and it was just not healthy, right? It was a toxic experience to continue. So she chose to cut off communication with him. But she said, I love this. She talked about how after forgiving her dad, she had all these memories that came back to her from childhood that she'd forgotten about. Great memories, like riding on the back of his scooter with her hands up and going to the thrift store with him, and just these wonderful things that she had forgotten. And so she says she doesn't actually have a relationship with her dad now, her living dad, but she has a better relationship with him per se than she did before. So it's important to realize that. And I will say, I'm actually a survivor of sexual assault, and I don't even barely think of that person anymore. I have no resentment toward him. I've certainly forgiven him, but I don't have a relationship with him, nor would I ever do that. So I want to share with you one really inspiring story, though, about this end of the spectrum, the forgiving and reconciling end of the spectrum, because I think it's really, really inspiring and can give us all perspective. So when I was in Rwanda, I knew that there was a town in rural Rwanda about 3 hours outside of Kigali that I wanted to visit. And I wanted to visit because I had heard about a program that united genocide survivors and genocide perpetrators for 6 months, 3 times a week. Okay, so this is a very in-depth program. This is not, forgive someone in a day and then be happy or something. This is like real work. So I knew I wanted to go there, and I wanted to see if I could interview some of the people who were participating. And I should say that these weren't random victims and perpetrators. These were the people who had been victimized and the people who had done that to them coming together specifically to talk about this and work through this. So it was run by the local Catholic parish, and I had arranged for me and my translator to take a bus to this rural location, and the local priest who ran the program was picking us up. So we get to the bus depot, we get off, we're waiting, and Father Ubald is his name. Father Ubald pulls up in this big white Land Rover, and he gets out, and he's got his white robes on, and we get into his car, and he says on the way, I hope you don't mind, but my daughter Giselle is going to be coming for dinner tonight. And I said, of course, that'll be wonderful. But he must have seen that I was confused because, of course, this is a Catholic priest. So I'm thinking, but how? What do you mean, your daughter, right? Did I miss something? Maybe Catholicism's different here in Rwanda. I don't know. And he must have noticed that I was confused. So he said, well, let me tell you the story. And so this is the story. So come to find, I knew nothing about this man's personal history. All I knew was that he ran this program. Well, Father Ubald had lost every single member of his family in 1994, and we are talking about nearly 70 people. Yeah, he was the sole survivor of his entire extended family. He somehow managed to escape to Congo. He went on to Europe, and when things had settled down in Rwanda and the violence was over, he came back, and he was really committed to preaching about forgiveness. Now, as you can imagine, this was not a popular thing to be preaching about at that time. It had just happened. This was very raw. This was not popular, but he was committed to it. And so he would go in and talk at the prisons that were filled with genocide convicts. He'd go in and give talks about apology and about amends and what does it look like to make amends when you've murdered people. And so he was giving a talk at this one jail, and afterwards a man came up to him and he said, Father, I've been working up my courage to come tell you this. I'm the man who murdered your mother. And he was crying, and he said, I'm so deeply sorry. Do you think you could ever forgive me? Father Ubald was taken aback. He was extremely emotional. This was his mother. And at the same time, he was committed to walking his talk. And he said, yes, I will. That I am committed to being able to forgive you. And so he started visiting this man in jail, and he would go, fairly regularly, and they would have conversations. And he discovered that this man's children were essentially orphans at this point. because his wife had died of an illness. And so the kids were being shuttled around to different relatives, but no one really had the money to send them to school. And so Father Ubald legally adopted these children, the children of the man who murdered his mother. He adopted his children. And this was the young woman who I got to meet, Giselle. And so she came to dinner, and she was this vibrant young woman. She was actually on her way to neighboring Burundi, where she was going to be attending medical school. And Father Ubald was giving her a check, and this was their last dinner before she was off to med school. So that was mind-blowing, right? And it was a story that I never even expected to come upon during my time in Rwanda. And I just wanted to share that with you all. So that was number 2. So these people realize that forgiveness is not reconciliation, it's not the same. Now, the third key habit of good forgivers is that they're spiritual. Now, what do I mean when I say spiritual, I don't mean religious. So the origin of the word religion, religio, refers to the worship of an external God. And certainly a number of the people who I write about in my book come from different religions. And there's people from all the major faiths represented. However, I don't mean religion, I mean spiritual. And so the Latin root of the word spiritu, that refers to courage, breath, and vigor. So we know that it takes huge courage to forgive, especially when we're forgiving big things. And people talk about how after they forgive something, they feel like a literal weight has been lifted. They feel like they can finally breathe again. So it takes courage, it gives you breath. And they also talk about how they feel more energetic, right? And I think all of us can kind of relate to this anecdotally. When you're carrying a grudge, it does kind of feel like a weight. And so people would say, it was like I could run around the block. I had so much more energy. And so it brings vitality. So that's one meaning of my usage of spirit and spiritual. And the other one is a sense of being part of something larger, a sense of being part of something larger than yourself. So Azim absolutely has this feeling, right? He is committed to this huge vision of a world where young people don't have to worry about getting shot. He's committed to, peace, really, world peace. So that is a huge purpose. And, then there's people who are really committed to their family and having a healthy family or their health. Like this, a purpose, it doesn't have to be this huge, world peace type thing, right? It just has to be meaningful and purposeful for you. How many of you have heard about Viktor Frankl? Yeah, well, okay, yeah, so it looks like a number of you have heard of him. So Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz. And he went on to write 30-some books. He was very prolific. The most famous is Man's Search for Meaning. But he also developed a kind of therapy that he called logotherapy. And it's a therapy that he structured around helping people create meaning and purpose in their lives. And he did that because he said that having meaning and purpose was the only way he survived the Holocaust. And it was the most important way he found to help his patients to, survive difficult things, but also just to have healthy, gratifying lives. So, for me, I will say, having the honor to come here, to be able to talk about this stuff with you guys, to be able to share these stories that I collected with you, that is a huge, huge purpose of mine. And not only that, I got to collect all of these great forgiveness tools, right? As I did the research and interviewed people, I got to collect all of these forgiveness habits and practice them. And I'm really grateful for that because, as I mentioned, I was just terrible at forgiveness before all of this. So bad. And I wanted to get better at it. I wanted to flex that muscle. I wanted to improve. And I did. And I'm so glad I worked on it. I don't think, and I'm not perfect by any means, right? I still get irritated and angry and all of that. But I don't indulge it as much, right? I'm just less willing to indulge that, anger and negativity. So I don't as much. But I'll also say that I honestly don't think I would be married if I hadn't have done all this research and collected the practices and really taken it on for myself. I don't think I would be a mom. I have a 4-year-old and an 8-month-old. And so I'm just extremely grateful that I got to do it and that I get to come here and share it with y'all. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about too is, and actually I want to talk a little bit about faith and forgiveness. I did get to do some research for a chapter about the faith roots of forgiveness. And what's cool is that whether you're practicing a particular religion or not, then all the major faiths have some wonderful things that can help us and guide us in this practice. So, the Jewish religion just had Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a time when people really reflect over the past year about what is there something they've done that they could seek forgiveness for, or that they would like to seek forgiveness for? Is there someone who they could forgive, right? And that's the way they start the year anew. In the Christian tradition, of course, there's all of Jesus Christ's teachings about turning the other cheek and a whole lot more than that. So there's a lot, and I did mention mindfulness before, but I'll mention it again because I think mindfulness meditation and just the practice of mindfulness is really, it's the most meaningful habit or practice that I found that was really a daily thing, right? That you can practice being mindful every single day, and even if you're not meditating, you can just take it on as a way to notice, right? Just notice your reactions with a commitment of not getting sucked away, not getting sucked down into the whirlpool of reactivity that we can fall prey to. So the next thing I wanted to share before our time kind of comes to a close here is something that's a huge part of my purpose, that lights me up, and I love talking about it, and it's something called restorative practices, and it comes from restorative justice. How many of you are familiar with restorative justice? Okay, yeah. So for those of you who don't know, restorative justice is an alternative structure or form of justice, and the focus of it is to rehabilitate perpetrators, heal victims, or help victims heal, and restore the damage that crime does to communities. So one of the basic practices of restorative justice, and we say restorative practices when it's not in the criminal justice arena, but in schools or hospitals, workplaces, families, other communities. One of the key aspects of this is called a restorative practice circle. And a circle is a very simple thing. Basically, you sit in a circle and each person takes turns sharing his or her version of what happened during a conflict or something that could have led up to a conflict. And then they share his or her feelings and thoughts about what happened. And then everyone shares ideas for solutions. So ideas of how, if this happens again, could we make it better? Or how could we avoid this happening in the future? And it really works. So I mentioned the program in Rwanda. And in that program, people weren't sitting in circles, and they weren't called circles per se. But the key aspect of that course, where victims of the genocide and their perpetrators got together 3 times a week for 6 months, the key parts of it were absolute authentic sharing, right, testimonial sharing on the part of the victims, and then on the part of the perpetrators, empathic listening with a commitment to do something to try to make amends. So apology and amends were part of that. And for these folks, that could be something like coming to work the fields of a person, whose relative they killed, and doing that for some period of time. Or it could be giving their victim's family a goat or a cow. And then in Baltimore, this school that I mentioned that I got to visit, that instituted circles specifically, restorative justice or restorative practice circles, they were able to slash suspensions by more than 200% in 3 years, which is a big deal. So at the beginning of this, before they had a restorative practices facilitator and they did circles, the teacher said they spent most of their time breaking up fights in the classroom, and they would do things like strategize where to sit members of different gangs at lunch in the cafeteria so that they wouldn't fight. I mean, this was what they were doing instead of teaching. So this was huge, right? To cut suspensions by more than 200% and pretty much eradicated fighting. Like when I was there, I think I spent a week there. There wasn't one fight when I was there. So I just love that. And I will say, for those of us who are looking for opportunities to do this stuff in our regular everyday lives, I just did a circle with my husband and my son, maybe 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. So my son is 4, and those of you who remember having a 4-year-old, or maybe do now, probably remember that they don't like going to bed. At least my son does not, right? He doesn't want to miss anything. He wants to stay up all night. And so bedtime can be really fraught in our house. And the other night, I noticed, I'm dealing with our 8-month-old, trying to get her to go to sleep. And I hear my husband trying to get our son to go up the stairs and then get on his little stool in the bathroom and brush his teeth. And it's just not going well. Like, my husband's getting frustrated. Our son's he's not listening. He's not doing it. He's refusing to go up the stairs. Then he's refusing to get on the stool, and it's just turning into a nightmare. My husband's yelling. And so afterwards, he came downstairs and I said, would you be open to having a conversation about this, the 3 of us? And he said, okay. And so we went upstairs and we had this conversation. And it was a circle. It was, what just happened? How do you feel about it? What do you think about it? And what are some ideas for how we can make this better next time? My son came up with some brilliant ideas for what to do, right? I mean, I was impressed. And I will say that bedtime has been mostly, not perfect, but it's been mostly a lot better since we did that. So, for those of you who are members of organizations, whether they be hospitals, offices, churches, schools, what have you, that's something that you can use to really, facilitate some conflict resolution and to prevent conflict, right, before it really gets extreme. So that brings me to the last point that I'd like to make, and that is that I have some homework for you. I hope that's okay with you. So I like to say forgiveness is actually not about the past, it's about the future. And forgiveness is not about your past, it's about your future. So I'd like to request that you take this on. So the first part of the homework is to think about someone who you could forgive. Like, think about, is there someone who you're just really annoyed or angry at and you could forgive? So please write a letter to that person. And you don't have to send it to them, obviously. It doesn't matter if this person is alive or dead. You can certainly forgive people who have died. But I highly, highly recommend writing a letter to that person, declaring your forgiveness, and just sharing whatever comes up for you. Then I want you to write a second letter. And this might even be the most important letter, and this one is to yourself. So self-forgiveness happens to be even more difficult, according to the researchers, than forgiving others. And a lot of us, I would say especially guys, I don't know, no offense here, maybe you're really bad at self-compassion, but I think that women tend to be just terrible at being nice to ourselves, and especially those of us who are mothers. We just constantly traffic in this guilt, right? This self-flagellation and sacrificing ourselves on the altar of motherhood. So, yeah, it's gross, right? So I'd like you to think about, 1, something that you can forgive yourself for, and 2, a way that you can be more compassionate with yourself. Is there something that you could allow yourself to do that you don't? Like, you love to ride horses and you don't let yourself because you have so many family obligations or work obligations or, something like that. How can you be nice to yourself? So write a letter to yourself, forgiving yourself for something, and then please take on some practices that are ways to treat yourself and be compassionate with you. And then the next thing is I would love for you to spend a little bit of time over the next couple weeks thinking about what purpose is your life for. Like if you could make up any purpose that you possibly wanted, what is that? Have you ever done that? Or did you have a purpose that really inspired you a number of years ago, but now it's kind of faded? Or maybe you've changed and life has moved on and it just doesn't light you up anymore. What can you create that's new and that really excites you? Or maybe not even excite, maybe just something that makes you feel like everything's okay, even though it's imperfect, right? Like if I can live inside this purpose, the world with all of its imperfections, can be okay, and I can be okay. So, thank you for even considering any of that. I know you probably didn't think you would get homework tonight. So I appreciate you. I appreciate you coming. I appreciate you listening. And I certainly appreciate those of you who are willing to take on that work, because it's not easy work, but it's extraordinary and it will make a huge difference, I promise. So as you're going about all of that, if you want tools and support, other ideas, inspiring stories, like I said, I collected all of those practices and habits that I collected, in my travels and in my reporting, and I put them all in the appendix of my book. And I will be signing my book right back there. So anyone who wants that as support, please come by. And again, just thank you so much. I appreciate you coming.
Well, was that great or was that great? I think she deserves another round of applause. And we're actually going to make her come back up here because we're not done with her yet, okay? So Megan is going to take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and someone with a microphone will come over to you in just a second. So let's get started. Let's see the hands. I see a couple over here.
I guess really what my question is what's the first step towards forgiveness? You identify this person that you know you need to forgive to be able to move on in your life, but what's the first real tangible step towards that?
Yeah, that's a great question. For anyone who didn't hear, she said, what is the first step? What's the first tangible step once I see that there's someone who I could forgive and it would make a difference? So the first step is first committing to forgive, right? And then after that, I would say that it's allowing yourself to feel whatever is there. I think, for a lot of people that can be anger and rage. For a lot of people, underneath that is really just deep sadness and hurt. So I think that's really important. And I know for me personally, different things work for different people, but for me to really get present to feelings and process them so I can let them go, I do a lot of writing, like dump and flush letters, where you just write it and tear it up. Or there's something called EFT tapping. It's called emotional freedom technique, and some therapists use it and recommend it, where you're tapping pressure points to kind of tap out, negative experiences or feelings and bring in the experiences that you want. So, there's different things, right? But I would say just feeling what's there is really important, and then continuously making that commitment to forgive. But there are a number of exercises, and one of the ones that I put in my book that I like, it happens to be empathy. So building empathy for whoever it might be. And, there is a specific exercise where you can go through steps to do that. But the long and short of it is kind of putting yourself in your imagination in that person's shoes and, really trying to imagine, okay, so a person who did that, why would they have done that? Like, what would have happened to that person that maybe would have driven that, right? That I think is helpful too.
I just happened to do my doctoral dissertation on 5 evidence-based ways that you recover when you've been hurt or harmed by someone.
Awesome.
So,
Congratulations.
Yeah, and I'm in the process of turning that into a book, so I definitely want to talk to you afterwards.
Great.
I did want to share one thing though. Of course, there's lots of ways to recover. I had to narrow mine down to 5 because it took me 7 years to get the dissertation done as it was. So I had to stop at some point. But is there anything in your book about when the person is not remorseful, when there's not an apology? One of the techniques I've used is the letter. The second letter isn't when you write to yourself, which I think is a great idea, but to have a letter coming back from the person that harmed you, and they don't acknowledge it, they don't admit it maybe, but there's no, so anyway, just my point being, it takes a lot longer, oftentimes when there's not one, but it doesn't mean it can't be done.
Right.
And I know that because my own father was a murder victim, and the person that killed him bragged about it. There wasn't ever any remorse. But it doesn't mean it can't be done.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, thank you for what you're doing. It's inspiring me to finish mine.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, she, I hope everyone heard that, was sharing about the fact that when there's not an apology, when a perpetrator is remorseless, it makes it more difficult to forgive. There's research around it, but I don't think we have to talk about that. It's pretty obvious why that would be. And that's certainly true, but that doesn't have to leave you in that victim place, right, of not being able to forgive for yourself and your own health and well-being. And I love that idea of writing a letter from the letter that you would love to have received, right? I love that. That's awesome. Thank you.
I just wanted to touch on what you said a minute ago about trying to maybe imagine why or how that the person said what they said or did what they did, trying to step into their shoes to figure it out. Okay, that's happening to me, but I can't get out of that. I'm stuck in that. And how do you get past that to even think that you want to forgive someone?
So
I'm trying to, I'm always like, okay, I know all the reasons it could be. I already know that, but I keep.
So you're kind of stuck in the question or the inquiry of why did this person do or say this? And it feels like you can't get out of that train of thought.
And I don't know if it's, is it fear? I don't want to go there about forgiveness.
I mean, it might just be, look, our objective, logical minds really like to explain things. And so it makes sense that you would want a logical explanation for why this person said or did what they said or did. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would say at the end of the day, something that might be useful to you is to just realize that people behave on the level of development or the level of consciousness that they're at. Period. And sometimes that development is not very high, right? And then you can move on. And I think one thing to focus on, I would encourage you to really give that what do you want your life to be for? Really give that some thought, because I think you'll find that whatever it is for you, whatever arises that inspires you, that you want to, get up every day for, if that whole ruminating about why someone said or did something, that's not, I promise you that's not in there, right? That's not in the purpose. So I think if we can have something that calls us forward out of the muck, that often is much more powerful than just trying to pull ourselves out of it, right? Is that helpful? I hope. Okay, good.
These have a great sense of humor, so I have a question or curiosity about what could a 4-year-old possibly suggest as a possible solution? Just
I love it. Thank you. Yeah, what could a 4-year-old possibly suggest that would make bedtime better? Well, of course, the first idea was ice cream, right? Lots of ice cream, right? More ice cream. But then, well, he said, I was impressed because, he shared, first of all, when I said, what is your version of what happened? He said, well, I didn't want to go up the stairs, and I didn't get on the stool, and I didn't brush my teeth. And, and he said, and then he felt upset with Dad, and he was mad and sad and all that. And so I said, what are your ideas about what would make bedtime better next time? He said, well, I could listen to Daddy, I could go up the stairs, and I could brush my teeth. I mean, it was very simple, right? It's nothing complex, but he said it, and then he did it more often. So that was pretty cool to have it come from him as opposed to, this, which is just doesn't work. So thank you. Oh, that's a great question. So do you not believe in confrontation? Oh, I do. So we should, yeah. I suppose we could agree on what we mean by confrontation, but I assume you mean holding people to account or being able to discuss things that we disagree with people about. Is that accurate? Okay. Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think, what's interesting about our country in particular today is that we've become so conflict averse, kind of, and yet we're so, no one wants to upset each other by having hard conversations. And unfortunately, we don't know how to do it anymore, right? People can't sit in a room and have a civil conversation about something they disagree about. It's crazy. So, and that, ironically, I think is at the heart of so many of our conflicts, is that we're trying to avoid conflict, and so we don't just have the conversations about, argument. This kind of ancient, the art of rhetoric has kind of been lost, and I think we need to recapture that, the art of argument. And then in terms of the other aspect of confrontation, which may be what you're talking about, which is really holding people to account for their actions, I absolutely believe that. And I think that, we can, this whole idea that to be forgiving, you have to be weak and you just have to take what happens and you can't confront people about their bad behavior, that's just nonsense. It's crazy. It doesn't work, right? So I think we have to get better at both. We have to get better at being forgiving and standing our ground when people are standing on our toes. There was this great story. I have a family friend who's a psychologist. He's my parents' age, and when I started working on the book, we were at a family party, and he was asking me about it, and I asked him some questions, and he said, yeah, if someone's standing on your toe, you don't say, I forgive you. You say, please get off my toe, right? That's the simplest and the best story that comes to mind about that for me. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Any last minute takers? Any more questions? All right. I could listen to her talk. Oh, we do have one. We have one last taker. I love it.
In this world of being workaholics, like most women are these days, having outside jobs and stuff, how do you treat yourself tenderly in the process?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think, how do we treat ourselves tenderly when there's constant demands, work, family, overwork maybe? I would say having boundaries, I think, is the most important thing. And I think in this effort to be nice, and being nice can be so detrimental to our well-being, we have to have boundaries and, respectfully decline certain invitations, not have to be everywhere and be all things to all people, and just really protect the time that we need. I'm an introvert. I need a lot of alone time. With a husband and 2 children and a day job and that's not a lot of time to be alone, right? But I sometimes do things like I'll go do a retreat by myself for the weekend, or I actually commute to work most days, and I get to sit on the train and I get to meditate, for 20 minutes. So just whatever that is for you, right? So these. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, so really being serious about protecting your time and doing things for yourself that are important. And there's someone who raised a hand right here.
What if you need someone to forgive you, but they're not receptive to forgiving you yet?
Yeah.
Like, abject apology is getting you nowhere. So what's the path to, I don't know, connecting with them and getting forgiveness?
So this is a really, really rich question. So what do you do when you really want someone's forgiveness, you've apologized, and the forgiveness is not forthcoming? So first, I do want to say quickly, there are some key steps to an effective apology, which may or may not be useful, but I just think it's important to say. So first, you want to acknowledge what you did and say you're sorry for that. Provide some sort of explanation. So this is not an excuse, it's an explanation for why you did or said that. And then the last part is a commitment moving forward to behave in a different fashion, right? So, and it's interesting because sometimes in an ongoing relationship with someone, this is obviously, you would say, well, I won't do that again, right? But if it's something that ended a relationship, like in my case, when I was growing up, I went through a mean girl phase, and I was extremely mean and bullied two girls in particular. And so at that point, when you're confronting something years later, it's a different process. But I think if there's nothing you can do to make amends for what you did, then it's almost like a living amends that people in recovery talk about, where how can you live your life in such a way that really honors the person you are committed to being now. So we've talked about that. So okay, if you've done that, this person is not interested in forgiving you. It's not happening. I would say that's when you really have to just kind of let it go. Now you could do what our friend here suggested and write a letter of what you would like that person to say, which I love, and I think that could be really powerful. Or you're back at the forgive yourself square again, right? Where, okay, I have apologized, I've made amends, I've done what I can do. This person has not forgiven me and maybe never will. And on some level, you have to love yourself enough to be okay with that. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, well, that's
Thank
all
you.
the time we have. She deserves another round of applause, right? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.